So, one of my viewers told me that Scott Ritter was on the Useful Idiots podcast, and I thought, Useful Idiots podcast? That's really interesting. If you don't know what a useful idiot is, a useful idiot in political jargon is a term used to reference a person perceived as propagandizing for a cause, particularly a bad cause originating from a devious, ruthless source without fully comprehending the cause's goals and who is cynically being used by the cause's leader. So that you'd call your podcast the Useful Idiot podcast, I find fascinating. It has Cold War origins. Here's another little bit about it. Europe's useful idiots, a Cold War term for unwitting allies of communism. These were people, we use this in America too, these were people that went over to Russia or the Soviet Union in the early days of the Soviet Union and said, see, I've seen the future. They're doing these great things here, not realizing that they didn't see the atrocities. They only saw the good things that the Soviets wanted them to see. A useful idiot is someone who unwittingly is manipulated by a foreign government to help a foreign government's agenda with the support of the said foreign government. Okay, with that being said, let's look at the Useful Idiots podcast. Now, I've never been here before. Now, Matt is actually a really well-known journalist. I don't know who Katie is, but Matt, I think, was connected to the Elon Musk Twitter files coming out, and I've read some of his books, but apparently he has a very anti-war kind of stance. Well, at any rate, so here is Scott Ritter a couple of times on here, and just go look at these couple of clips with Scott Ritter. I have not watched them. We'll watch them together. Let's go to Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The big news of the week is this failed revolt, protest, whatever you want to call it, in Russia by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the mercenary Wagner force. Now, the dominant line we got initially was that this is going to turn into a civil war in Russia. Lots of Russians are going to be killed. That was promoted by the likes of Michael McFaul and Applebaum. After the revolt was quickly put down and not even a single shot was fired on Moscow, the new narrative became, okay, Putin avoided a coup, but he's considerably weaker as a result. What do you make of what happened and this narrative that we're getting in the West? Now, before Scott speaks, let's unpack that and think through this. Is Putin stronger because of Prigozhin's Freedom March, coup, whatever that thing was, or is he weaker? Let's just think about that. Does it expose chinks in his armor, or does it make him look stronger? I think it makes him look pretty weak comparatively, and people that were thinking he's invulnerable now think he's vulnerable. But let's hear what Scott has to say. That Putin is permanently damaged as a result of this.
Well, I think I'll contradict McFaul on both counts.
Of course.
We were extraordinarily dangerous, we being the world. And I think we have to understand this isn't just an internal Russian issue. This is an issue of global importance. Let's just set the stage for a second. Russia is a nuclear power engaged in an...
He's right that this is an issue of global importance, and this war in Ukraine is critically important because it could become World War III. Not because of the way that Ritter sees it, but because Putin must be stopped.
Existential war, a war it has defined as of existential nature against the...
No, wait a minute. It's a special military operation. It's not existential. It's not existential until you redefine it by grabbing 4 oblasts and then say, if you come back on my oblasts, then, well, actually 5 if you include Crimea, but if you come back on these oblasts, then, it's existential because you're fighting against Mother Russia.
Collective West. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of a rogue mercenary army that Russian intelligence believes, whom Russian intelligence believes has been actively conspiring with Ukrainian intelligence since at least January of this year, is now leading a march on Moscow, the goal of which is to overthrow the government of Russia. People can say, well, he never threatened Putin. He did actually threaten Putin.
Okay, so that he was trying to overthrow Putin, I don't think that seems to fit. He seems to have been working for Putin, trying to become a greater strongman within Putin's army. But I could be wrong. That's just my read. And that he was working with Western intelligence or Ukrainian intelligence seems a little far-fetched given how awful he has been to Ukraine. But let's hear him.
First of all, when you say I'm coming in to get rid of your defense minister and the chief of staff of your armed forces, you're saying I'm coming after you. And then after Putin didn't,
those are very different things. That's not true at all.
Roll over, he said, "Yeah, you're done too." So no, this was an armed coup designed to topple Vladimir Putin, the leader of a nuclear-armed state engaged in an existential struggle for its survival with the collective West, the intelligence services of which might be controlling Prigozhin. So let's just get the record straight here.
So if it was a coup, it was the worst coup ever, and that he was working with the collective West is an assertion, but he hasn't established it yet. So let's see if he does.
Here. So there was a chance for not only real violence, and there was violence. People tend to forget that numerous helicopters and one fixed-wing aircraft were shot down by the Wagner forces, killing 10 to 12 airmen. And the Russian helicopters, military helicopters, did fire on the Wagner column, killing 2 Wagner soldiers and wounding 3. So there was violence. It's not like there was no violence. And there was the potential for great violence. As Wagner rolled towards Moscow, Putin, in addition to having Lukashenko make a phone call, find a peaceful end to this, mobilized 2,500 of Russia's best special operations forces, who were deployed in the fields in Serpukhov, a city south of Moscow. They were deployed to receive an assault. That means they were ready for war. And they were back.
So they did make preparations. They were digging out roads so that, it would be hard for them to cross over on the route. They were putting rings around Moscow. Whether he is right about that or wrong about it, it doesn't really matter because they were making preparations because they did perceive a threat. So, okay.
Backed by 10,000 Russian National Guardsmen with heavy equipment behind them. Who were there to reinforce, outflank, and mop up whatever was left of Wagner. Meanwhile, down in Rostov, where Yevgeny Prigozhin had seized the commander of the headquarters of the Southern Military District, responsible for overseeing the special military operation. So again, let's just understand. Prigozhin seized the headquarters responsible for overseeing Russian military operations in an active war zone in the midst of a Ukrainian offensive.
And he did. And the Russian military just kind of rolled over and was like, okay, you're in charge. And what's interesting about that is why? Like, why did they just allow that to be? I still haven't figured out that Rubik's Cube puzzle yet, but that's what's happened.
Nice guy. 10,000 Chechen Akhmat special forces had been mobilized and had surrounded Rostov. And the signal had been sent to Prigozhin, "We're coming for you. We're going to kill you as only Chechens can." Now, they didn't say that. That's what they meant.
Now, he's talking about the Chechens like they're really that big and bad. And my understanding is that they weren't really that impressive fighters. Anyway, that's just what I understand. And Prigozhin has been at odds having strong words with the Chechens about how they're really not that tough, even though they claim to be. They seem to like the bling more than actually fighting.
The Chechens posted a video saying, "We're here in Rostov. We don't know what's going on. It's crazy, but we've got our orders and we are going to execute our orders." So Prigozhin was suddenly confronted with the fact that he and all of his men were about to die, because that's what would have happened had Putin said, "Pull the trigger, boys, pull the trigger." But the sad thing is that thousands of Russian soldiers would die. And because you're talking about combat operations in an environment where there are civilians, the potential for hundreds, if not thousands of civilians would die. And once you have people dying, the potential for emotions to become inflamed becomes real. At the same time Prigozhin was doing this, the Ukrainian intelligence services were seeking to implement an operation in Moscow coordinated with the movement of Prigozhin's forces that would have had subversive elements blow up, set off explosives amongst civilian targets, creating a sense of terror, of fright.
Okay, now he might be onto something. I don't know how much of that is Prigozhin related, but I bet whatever assets the Ukrainian intelligence had in and around Moscow, and it's probable that people that, for example, the drones that went over might have been localized drones that we talked about in the news over the last few months. Whoever they had, they'd want to amplify that. So I have no doubt that they'd want to amplify that. If you're Ukraine, you want to see this go south for the Russians as quickly as possible. But that it was Prigozhin that was they're the useful idiot of Ukraine. I don't see it. He hasn't proved it or established it yet, but that's his theory.
As Prigozhin was advancing, phone calls and internet messages were being sent to Russian civilians saying, Wagner will save you. Gather in, I think it's Manajna Square. What were they seeking? A new Moscow Maidan, to get civilians to gather in the square, protesting against Putin, praising Wagner, praising Prigozhin. This is the coup. This is real, guys. This isn't.
So now I'm sure he's relaying the Russian state line or what Russia wants to put out, but that's a really interesting nuance. I wasn't even aware of that's what was going on, and this is why we listen to that side. We take it with a grain of salt, but this is why we listen. So let's say that there was a Russian Maidan. That would be terrifying to Putin. Right? This is like Putin's worst nightmare. Actually, his worst nightmare is what happened to Gaddafi.
Ended because Putin is a strong leader. Prigozhin had been carrying out a propaganda campaign since at least January.
This happened because Putin is an authoritarian leader who does not get information from his underlings, because you can't when you're an authoritarian, because you want to protect you, not the boss, right? And so. Yes, he's a strong man in the sense that he is an authoritarian dictator who will be ruthless, but he is not he's not strong as a leader. Okay, so let's just keep going.
January that targeted Shoigu and Gerasimov and Putin indirectly. It was a campaign designed to win over the hearts and minds of not only the Russian people, but the Russian oligarchs, Russian generals. He was saying the generals are weak. We need real soldiers, real leaders, real men to come in and finish this job.
He was saying that.
Led to believe by Ukrainian intelligence that as he moved on Moscow, people would rally around him, that generals would.
So he keeps saying that Ukrainian intelligence was doing this, and I saw this in some Russian press that it was Western or Ukrainian intelligence that was working with him. I'd see no evidence of that anywhere else, other than something that, say, RT might have written.
Would defect over to his cause, bringing soldiers over. And you saw early postings where Prigozhin had photographs that had nothing to do with reality, but you saw the photographs of Russian soldiers with no weapons saying the border guards have put down their arms and welcome Wagner forces with open arms. Wasn't true, but they're trying to create this perception of surrender. It didn't happen.
Well, actually, the border guards were very inept and just kind of let them pass and stepped aside. It's not that they didn't have any weapons, but they weren't about to take on Wagner.
But he defected. Not a single person defected. Everybody rallied around.
Okay, so now I have to say that at least in Western press, what he just said is completely wrong about defection. That there were at least, if not defections, people that were stepping aside, letting him pass, not willing to fight him, letting him move through freely.
Putin. So, Mr. McFall, Ann Applebaum, and everybody else, you don't know what you're talking about. We came very close to a nuclear.
Actually, McFall is brilliant. Applebaum is brilliant, and I'm pretty sure that I talked about McFall not yesterday. Was it yesterday or the day before? In a huge article about. I guess it was the day before. A huge article about why Putin being in charge has shaped the destination of Russia. And it's a great article.
Nuclear war. Let me tell you why. Because had there been a civil war, Russia would have had to put its nuclear forces on full alert, because you have a coup happening at a time when the Russian intelligence services are briefing Putin that this is orchestrated by American forces, British forces, etc. They're trying to create.
But they're always briefing Putin that this is orchestrated, whatever's going on is orchestrated by Americans in the West and whatever. Like, Putin has thought this from the very start.
This.
Putin thought this in 2014, that it was America behind the Maidan uprising. So there's nothing new about that.
There could have been uncertainty. There could have been panic. Who knows? There could have been a nuclear war. So it's not a game, guys. This was dangerous. The question I have for Putin or for Biden is the following.
It's fascinating that it's only pro-Russian side constantly talking about nuclear stuff. I find that really interesting. It's like they're trying to highlight it in order to continue to saber rattle, to escalate to the point where you'll capitulate. It's really interesting.
Following. You claim you did nothing because you didn't want the Russians to think that you were involved. And yet you also claim that you were very worried about the security of Russia's nuclear weapons. Well, which is it, pal? Were you worried about the security of Russia's nuclear weapons, or did you not want to be involved? Because let me put it this way. Many times the United States calls up their Russian counterparts and says, hey, there's a terrorist cell operating in St. Petersburg getting ready to blow up a device. And the Russian forces go, thank you very much. They go in and they disrupt it because we had that kind of cooperation. So if we did to stop a terrorist from blowing up an explosive device in St. Petersburg, and this is a statement of fact, it actually happened. Why aren't we willing to call up and say, hey, Vlad, Prigozhin's getting ready to make a move to overthrow you. We're concerned that...
Okay, and so that's a good question, except, well, let's back up. We do know that the United States did know a day or two before this actually kicked off, but was Prigozhin going to try to grab a nuclear device? Doesn't look like that was what was going on. It looks like he was being disruptive, doing his freedom march, coup, whatever it was, in order to make himself a bigger authoritarian underling to Putin. That's what it appeared like, not that he was going to grab a nuke.
A, you might think it's us. It's not. And B, we think that he might be targeting a nuclear storage facility that's located around Borin. We want to give you a heads up so you can take the appropriate measures. Why didn't we do that? Because we didn't want to stop Prigozhin. Because we were hoping that Prigozhin would start a civil war that would prompt forces to be withdrawn, etc. This was a very
that was a legitimate hope throughout much of Ukraine, and I think that would have been terrible. A civil war or Russia descending into some kind of factional fighting. I don't want that. I want Russia to be defeated on the battlefield. I don't want Russia to be a failed state with multiple warlords with nuclear weapons. Don't want that.
Very dangerous thing. Putin is stronger than ever. But I have to tell you,
he's not stronger than ever. This is the fascinating thing. And this is the narrative that I see in RT a lot, that Putin, we're stronger, we're more united than we've ever been. No, you're not. You're actually a lot weaker. And now people are thinking, I guess they can defeat him. Right? Or I guess a coup or some kind of something could win, where he looked invulnerable before, but now we realize it's kind of like after 9/11, we started to wake up and realize, wow, we enjoy all this freedom, and that freedom can be used against us. It's that kind of thing writ large in Russia right now.
If you're Russian, you can't be proud of this. This is not a good look. This is Banana Republic type look, especially given that Russia just had a wonderful moment at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum where they demonstrated to the world that they have defeated sanctions once and for all.
Yeah, he's talking about the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. Like, most major companies did not want to touch it because it was kryptonite. And he's talking about it like this was a major moment for them. No, it was actually the worst St. Petersburg Economic Forum. So the St. Petersburg Economic Forum is supposed to be like Davos, but in Russia. And it used to be that Western companies were falling all over themselves to try to be part of it. And they were like, we don't know if we really want to be there anymore. And so he's talking about it as a major moment. I don't know what he's thinking. But that's how it was viewed in RT and TASS and Pravda, although all the Western papers were explaining who wasn't there. And it was a very different look.
The Russian economy is churning ahead full speed, the strongest economy in the history of Russia.
Oh my
And then they
gosh.
have this.
That
The part that I
he's in la la land if he's saying that this is the strongest economy in the history of Russia. If you just look at the value of the ruble, that alone should tell you. Let alone other economic indicators, it's not the strongest economy in the history of Russia.
have a hard time getting my head around is this notion that Prigozhin could have been working with Ukrainian and Western intelligence. And I realized there's, even before all this happened, there were these Pentagon leaks saying that Prigozhin offered Ukraine the coordinates of Russian forces. But that, I mean, I found hard to believe just based on the fact that Prigozhin, I don't think, or Ukraine wouldn't need Prigozhin to tell them where Russian forces are, because I presume that the U.S. is already
It's an
giving them
intelligent
those
question.
So what use could Prigozhin provide there? And meanwhile,
That was a really intelligent question by the useful idiot commentator. I'm not calling him names. I'm saying he's a commentator from this channel. Right. I mean, we can see with satellites and other things like where the formations are. We don't need Prigozhin for that.
he is leading the force that killed thousands of Ukrainian forces
That's
in
true.
Bakhmut, and his criticism all along
He's actually kind of a
was
bad
that
guy.
Russia wasn't being aggressive enough inside Ukraine, and that's his main criticism of these Russian leaders. And so
That's right. And when the people were coming out to congratulate Prigozhin, it was that they were coming out and saying, yeah, that's right, you get them, you go give it to the Ukrainians good. They weren't like overthrow Putin. They were saying, go back there and do the job right. It's a very different picture than what you otherwise might have thought.
and that he wanted more support. And meanwhile, you do have this looming deadline where Wagner was going to be subsumed by the Russian military, forced to sign contracts with the Russian military, which would have sidelined him. So to me, the official story that he was just angry about that and was trying to basically force Russia's military leadership to back down and let him keep his little mercenary force and force Russia's military to be even more aggressive in Ukraine. That to me seems more plausible than this notion he was working with Ukraine and Western intelligence.
Well, why can't both be true? And let me tell you why I believe both are true. Russia is a nation that's based upon the rule of law. I know Anna Applebaum will freak out and say, no, Putin's a dictator and there's no law in Russia, but it's actually...
It is supposed to be based on the rule of law, but it doesn't necessarily follow. There's an interesting phrase, anything for my friends and the law for everyone else. And that's kind of how the oligarchs get along, right? I mean, there's like, it's almost like Animal Farm. Some are more equal than others. That's kind of what goes on. And the Duma has passed so many things unanimously that have taken away freedoms that Russians otherwise would have had since the beginning of this war that it's incredible to watch.
Actually, a nation fully governed by the rule of law. And there is a couple of laws in place here. One, basic contract law. The Russian government had signed a one-year contract on 1 May 2022 with Yevgeny Prigozhin, providing him with $940 million to create a combat force of contract soldiers who worked for the Wagner Group, not for the Russian Ministry of Defense. And Prigozhin executed that contract. He made a lot of money doing it. $940 million, of course, a lot of it goes to building this force. But understand that one of the first things that Wagner did, that Prigozhin did, once it became clear that the fighting was extraordinarily difficult, extraordinarily bloody, was to talk to his commanders. He said, we have these elite guys that we've recruited, and they're dying by the bushel. And it's going to be very expensive for me to go out and recruit.
That's a really interesting thing to hear Scott Ritter admit, because Scott Ritter is usually the one talking about they're going to fall next week. And to admit that fighting in Ukraine was difficult is extraordinary. I mean, you don't really hear him do that very often.
Recruit new ones. How do we solve this problem? And they said, well, half the problem is the initial phase of the battle, where we have to aggressively push forward under fire. We're going to lose a lot of guys there, but we don't really need the most skilled people in the world. And so Prigozhin went, why don't I go to the prisons and recruit prisoners? Which he did. Estimate.
And that's really an evil way of using up humans. I mean, and Scott seems to be like enamored with this guy doing that. Like, wow, that was a brilliant strategic move.
Are between 30 and 50,000 inmates were ultimately recruited by Wagner. 21 days of training. Anybody who says that every Wagner fighter is an elite fighter, you have no clue what elite means. 21 days of training does not produce an elite fighter. It does produce somebody who has basic skills who can be an elite fighter implementing these tactics. It's interesting how Prigozhin saying Shoigu and Gerasimov are responsible for the deaths of thousands of Russians, that irresponsible, bad tactics. I could do a better job. Just time out, people. Shoigu and Gerasimov are responsible for the current state of Russian defenses. In the first 3 weeks of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, 13,000 Ukrainians died.
No,
Vladimir Putin says that the kill ratio is 10 to 1.
Yeah. So he's repeating Russian lines. Vladimir Putin says the kill ratio is 10 to 1. There's no possible way that the kill ratio was 10 to 1. I mean, there's just like the math does not add up. But this is what he repeats.
That means 1,300 Russians have died. That's a big number, by the way. But 13,000 Ukrainians.
That means only 1,300 Russians for 13,000 Ukrainians? I mean, come on. Like,
have died. In the battle for Bakhmut, using these tactics that Prigozhin used, the prisoner tactics, they killed 75,000 Ukrainians, but they lost 30,000 Russians. Now, I'm a simple.
Whoa, wow, that's there. He's admitting that it's only 2 to 1, or a little bit better than 2 to 1. How could he be saying that? This is absurd. I mean, his math on what's going on, it's unbelievable. And remember, the Ukrainians were the defenders, not the attackers, throughout most of the Battle of Bakhmut. So, wow.
But that's basically a 2 to 1 kill ratio. So if you're going to be Prigozhin and try and make the argument that my approach is better in terms of preserving Russian life, how do you do that? You can't. You can't square the two. This has nothing to do about tactics and everything. Prigozhin made a business decision to bring in the prisoners. He slaughtered them. He sacrificed them. He threw them into the meat grinder to achieve a victory on the battle.
It's really interesting to hear Scott Ritter make that kind of analysis about that Prigozhin was throwing him into the meat grinder. I mean, usually in Russian state media, you hear the meat grinder, but it's Ukrainians that are being ground, not Wagner. Well, maybe you'll hear revisionist stuff about Wagner moving forward because now they're persona non grata.
I'll tell you why that's important in a second. But he did so with total disregard for human life. So the notion that Prigozhin, some sort of genius military man who cares about the lives of Russians, is absurd. He threw them away. He sacrificed them. He ground them up in the meat grinder. Now let's ask why he did this. You see, it was a business decision. He started recruiting them to make money. He's making a lot of money, by the way, because the cost of an inmate, both in terms of your salary, you don't have to pay him as much, but you've been budgeted for a full-scale Wagner guy, now you're paying for an inmate. And when they die, you don't have to pay the reparations. They're inmates. They go in the ground. That's it. Nobody gets paid.
So if you want to know which side is the side that's the good guys and which are the bad guys, who's doing the evil? Like, this is evil time and time again. Bad cause. You poorly train them, you use them in a meat grinder, and then you don't pay for their funeral or whatever expenses come with their death. If you want to know who's the good guys, it's not the Russians.
So you're making tens of millions of dollars that are going into your pockets. Good business deal for Prigozhin. And remember, he's a businessman. He has no military experience whatsoever. A businessman.
That's true.
Now, and I also understand, he didn't want anybody to know. Nobody talked about Wagner up until a certain point. If you remember, Bellingcat wrote some articles that said Prigozhin was associated with Wagner, and he sued them for defamation.
That's also right, because Wagner used to be not actually a thing. Like, it was illegal. So there is still a law that it's illegal to run your own military. I believe there's still a law, or there at least one time was, that it was illegal to have these private armies on Russian soil. Prigozhin for a long time denied that he actually had anything to do with Wagner. So, yeah.
And how dare you say I'm a member of Wagner, I'm associated with Wagner. But then something happened. You see, Wagner exists in the Donbass because it's not Russian soil. Wagner can get away with creating this unit on the Donbass soil as long as it was the independent.
Well, I'm glad that he's admitting that it's not Russian soil, because the West doesn't believe it's Russian soil either.
Soil of Lugansk and Donetsk. But in September of 2022, there was a
Here we
referendum,
go.
and the Donbass became Russia. And the second that happened, Wagner had a problem because, legally speaking, they can't operate on Russian soil. There's no Russian law that permits a private military contractor having a private army operating on Russian soil. Now, Prigozhin had a one-year contract, and because contract law is everything, it was agreed that this contract would be played out. But at the end of the contract, Wagner had to convert to a volunteer unit within the Ministry of Defense, which means Prigozhin.
Yeah, I don't think that theory really holds because had Prigozhin not had this fight, this squabble with the Russian Ministry of Defense, I think they would have just extended it and kept going. I don't think that that's in it at all. It's an interesting explanation, but I don't think he's right about it.
Prigozhin loses his money-making abilities. One of the problems that Prigozhin was running into is he couldn't recruit prisoners anymore because the prisoner, in order to have the contract with the Russian.
And now the Ministry of Defense, the Duma was passing a law that would allow the Ministry of Defense to do what Wagner did by recruiting prisoners and doing the same kind of evil again.
Government needs a full 6-month term. And if Wagner's term is going to run out on 1 May 2023, that means the last prisoner intake you could take is 1 December. And so he can't recruit prisoners anymore, so now he's got a problem. He's got to throw his boys into the fighting. The other problem he has is he has to win the hearts and minds of people. Notice when he came out. September 25th is when the referendum took place in Lugansk. September 26th is when Prigozhin issued his telegram interview saying, "Yeah, by the way, I'm the head of Wagner." Why did he do that? Because he knew he had a PR problem. He knew that if he left it, he would lose Wagner, lose his money. So he started saying, "I'm the head of Wagner." Then he started saying, "Look how great Wagner is." He started attacking Shoigu and Gerasimov, criticizing them. The battle for
So he could be onto something there, worried about that contract, but I don't think the contract was the legal reason on the official legal reason, but it might have been what was bothering Prigozhin. That's interesting point.
Bakhmut should not have been fought. Wagner had just, back in, I think in March, April, Wagner had a great victory in Soledar, the neighboring city. At that point in time, the Russian military wanted to pause.
So if Bakhmut is small, Soledar is tiny. Yes, there was a victory there, but great victory is a bit of a stretch for the size of the place.
Stop. They didn't see a need to go into Bakhmut because it had no strategic value whatsoever. It's there. Let the Ukrainians be.
So does it have strategic value or not? Yes or no? And if they take the place, they rave, they crow about how it has such strategic value that we've taken this great Bakhmut.
Dug in, we'll just pound them with artillery. But Prigozhin had to create the perception of the invincibility, of the almighty purpose of Wagner. So he created the meat grinder.
Well, he created the meat grinder. He just said artillery. He created the meat grinder because what the Russians would generally do, and what they did with Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, is just use artillery to pound the place to smithereens until there was nothing left first. And they didn't have the artillery to do it, so they had to send these prisoners in to their deaths.
This operation to inflict casualties on the Ukrainians, but in doing so, he threw away the lives of 30,000 inmates, 20,000 inmates, 10,000 of his own people. Threw them into the meat grinder. But that's all anybody talked about now. It seized the headlines. The meat grinder, Wagner leading the fight, Wagner, the heroes of Russia. And that's all everybody talked about. And then when the battle ended, what did Prigozhin do? Threw a temper tantrum, shouted at Shoigu. And why? Because all of his plans were to no, didn't reach any fruition. Shoigu said, "Hey, good job. But by the way, we told you not to fight this fight. You were supposed to be done by 1 May. You entered Bakhmut and kept this battle going for 20 additional days because you want a contract, you want to violate the law, you want to violate what we've said. Ain't going to happen. We give you a 2-month extension, get your troops out of Bakhmut, settle down in Lugansk, and be prepared to transfer over." And that's when Prigozhin went over there.
So I wonder how much of this was so the infighting's great for Ukraine, right? If Prigozhin and Shoigu are at odds with each other, it makes the Russian offensive, much more difficult, or much more difficult for them. It's good for the Ukrainians. So, but I don't know in his analysis if this is what happened or if Prigozhin has become a threat or just what exactly. But I do know that it's made them less effective, and that's a good thing for Ukraine.
Started stewing. He had relationships with Ukrainian intelligence. It's not just the story about the coordinates. I don't believe that story either. That makes no sense. But we know that he was in contact with Ukrainian intelligence in Africa, and we know that they had ongoing relationships. One of the ways we know about this is look at how Zelensky responded when the Washington Post confronted him with that. He didn't respond by, rumors, speculation. He was like, how do you know this? Where's your source? This is treason. Whoever talked to you is.
So asking how you know this is a good question. Where's your source? That's a good question. And if somebody is saying, working that way, of course Zelensky's going to think that that is treasonous. So I don't know that that's actually proving anything for Ritter.
It was treasonous. I mean, Zelensky is panicking as he's told this.
Well, I'm not sure.
And it was a second source. The Americans were listening to Ukrainians talking about, it wasn't about coordination or coordinates. It was about Wagner seeking to overthrow or put a coup d'etat in Moldova. So it's there. There's other evidence that indicates that Wagner was in contact with the Ukrainians. And believe me, if you're in contact with the Ukrainians, that means that you're at least indirectly in contact with MI6 and the CIA. So there's an intelligence aspect here that the Russians are aware of. Lavrov's hinted at it. He said there will be an investigation into this. Why bring it up if it doesn't exist? So,
and if this is the case, why Prigozhin is still alive, I can't figure out. Because if anything that Ritter said was true here, Prigozhin needs to stay away from hotel balconies, right? And why they would allow him to, sure, you get a free pass, we'll forgive all your past and allow you to, just retire to Belarus. I don't understand.
Well, I think that Prigozhin was basically a businessman who lost his $1 billion deal and who was turning to foreign sources to assist in facilitating a coup d'etat that would topple Putin, put him in power, and he would be able to stay in power by saying, I can get sanctions lifted, I can bring an end to the war in Ukraine. Because look at what he said before he went in. He spouted all Ukrainian talking points. We shouldn't have gone to war to begin with. We went to war on a lie. This is all about, the empowerment of the Russian elite. This is
so it's interesting that he says that these were Ukrainian talking points, and they were lining up with it. But it was in order, as I understood it or as I interpreted it, to undermine the Russian Ministry of Defense and say they're lying to you, boss. These were lies, and I don't lie to you, boss. And so. I'm not sure that it was particularly Western talking point so much as to undermine Shogu and
war that
Gerasimov.
Doesn't need to be fought. He's saying all that. Why? So he can be the peacemaker?
Quick follow-up, Scott. It's one thing to commit a failed mutiny. It's another thing to commit treason. And so if indeed Prigozhin, as you suspect, did work with Western and Ukrainian intelligence, how does Putin let him live?
Yeah, so that's my point.
Putin promised him amnesty for the mutiny, and sent him to Belarus. Putin didn't. I call this the Al Capone effect. Al Capone was a murderer, committed a lot of crimes. He went to jail for tax evasion. Okay, Prigozhin committed treason. An armed insurrection is the living embodiment of treason, and Putin has pardoned him for that sin. Go forth, go to Belarus, and sin no more. But when he announced, it's amazing because Putin came out and he basically said, yeah, by the way, we had a contract with Wagner, $940 million. Oh, and we gave Prigozhin a sweetheart deal too, a 1-year contract, concurrent, worth $900 million to provide food to the Russian army. Now, we don't know if it was spent right, if they walked away with it, but we're going to look at that.
Well, that's really interesting that it raised that, because even in that speech, and I pointed this out, even in that particular speech, Putin said, and I hope he didn't steal too much, like admitting the corruption. So maybe Ritter's right. Maybe Ritter's onto something here.
And I'm telling you right now that Prigozhin is a crook, a criminal, and the Russians are going to uncover massive corruption on his part, and he will be prosecuted for those crimes. The other thing is, if they find out that if they find the proof that he was actively colluding with foreign intelligence services, that's a different crime. He only got pardoned for one crime, taking troops in. The other crimes, he's still susceptible for, and he's under house arrest equivalent in Belarus, where he can't run away. So no, he's dead man walking. His days are numbered.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens to him. The Russians do tend to love to prosecute rather, for tax evasion for their enemies of the state, and so we'll see how that all works.
They needed to get him out of the situation so that the Wagner troops would peacefully disperse, because he did build up this cult of personality. The loyalty of the Wagner people to Prigozhin is real. It's genuine. But notice this. Of the 25,000 Wagner soldiers, only 8,000 followed him into Russia proper. The remaining 17,000 stayed in their camps in Lugansk because they said, we're not going to be a party to this.
That's right. It wasn't all 25,000. And you see this other places where on Russian state TV will say, well, he had 25,000 that were coming after Moscow or whatever. No, it wasn't 25,000. It was only a small fraction.
Lukashenko now, the prime minister of Belarus, is saying that he brokered this deal that Putin wanted to eliminate Prigozhin and attack Wagner, and he convinced him not to do this. Do you think that's true?
I don't think that Vladimir Putin is somebody who is swayed. I think that Vladimir Putin said, if Prigozhin doesn't stop, I'm going to kill everybody. That's just the way it's going to be.
He really loves Vladimir Putin. And you could see, I don't think that Putin can be... Okay, so I think, if I understand correctly, the FSB was in Prigozhin's home, in his offices, shutting down his troll farm, had his family, and could very legitimately have done them harm. But what does Lukashenko gain out of this? Will Lukashenko gain someone who can, in the meantime, have Prigozhin maybe train his military or something? I don't know. It's a Rubik's Cube, and I haven't quite figured it out, but that Putin is just a strong figure that is not going to whatever. I don't see it. I really don't see that Putin is that strong. He's weaker than we thought, and he's been exposed.
And Lukashenko said, well, I know Prigozhin. And Putin's like, and? Well, I can call Prigozhin. And? I maybe can get Prigozhin to stop. And? Why are you talking to me? Because I'm telling you right now, if he doesn't turn around, I'm going to kill him. Lukashenko.
So this is speculation on Ritter's part. I don't know that he has any insight or any valid sense of what Prigozhin and Lukashenko's conversation was, but okay, I can speculate too, but let's. It's probably best not to.
Lukashenko wouldn't have made that call unless Putin said make that call. So Lukashenko can take all the credit he wants. He deserves credit for brokering this thing, but let's not pretend for a second that this is Vladimir Putin sitting there saying, I'm going to kill him, and Lukashenko's calling up going, hey, boss, I could cut a deal. I'm a peacemaker. I'm a good guy. This is the other way around, where Putin is telling Lukashenko, if you have any pull with this guy, you better call him right now, because in about 5 minutes, I'm going to kill everybody.
Yeah, I'm not sure that was what was going on, but it could be. I wasn't there, so I don't know, so I can't say that it wasn't. And that's the difference between Scott and I. He's saying this like, I know that this was what's happening, and I'm saying we really don't.
About what you think Prigozhin was expecting to happen and hoping to happen?
Sure. Again, now, Aaron, I know you're the professional journalist, and we're going to delve into the realm of speculation. That's always dangerous in journalism, but I'm just being upfront about it. Everything we've talked about so far, I feel comfortable that I can put to a point and say, this is it. But now we're getting into, the darker world of speculation. But
at least
this
he's
is speculation. I'll call it informed speculation, because I'm going to be talking about MI6.
And that's fair. Like, for him to be saying, like, this is speculation, even that it's informed speculation. Now, I would question his sources for that, but let's say, at least he's prefacing it. This is the best that Scott Ritter's ever been by saying that this is just speculation, because much of what he says is speculation, but he says it as if it's true.
And how they handle human sources. And I do have direct experience in that dating back to my Iraq days. MI6 operates a London station. And London station is home to all sorts of defectors, including several oligarchs. One, I think, is of note, Khodorkovsky. I think, he, billionaire, operates an information warfare center on behalf of MI6, closely coordinates with Bellingcat, probably an MI6 asset. So we have that there. Prigozhin's a businessman. There's, in addition to the 2 failed contracts that he lost, that's nearly $2 billion. Ramzan Kadyrov gave a statement where he talked about other business failures on the part of Prigozhin, that he had tried to do certain things. And one of the things that came out is a real estate deal for his daughter in St. Petersburg that went south, that he was expecting to get it and it went south. Real estate in St. Petersburg, on when you get up into the dollars, is a very complicated affair. That involves a lot of fingers, a lot of hands, and many of those hands don't reside in St. Petersburg. They reside outside of St. Petersburg, probably in London, and probably controlled by MI6. So here we have Prigozhin, who is sending out all the red flags in the world. I mean, he's already in January, you have foreign intelligence services talking about him talking with Ukrainian intelligence services. Even if that's not true, it came from an official document, which means the intelligence services are talking about. He has red flags going. This is a man whom everybody is aware of now. They're following his businesses. The U.S. has indictments on him. The FBI has a file this thick on him. He's not an unknown person. And so everybody's following him. Now, the British, they're going to sit there and say, okay, so what is his primary motivating factor? It appears to be greed. This man likes money. So what do we need to do? We need to create opportunities for him involving money. And then we need to have those opportunities collapse so that he's even more desperate, so that we can then say, hey, we have a really good business opportunity for you if only this happens. So the response would be, but if I do this, what assurances do I have? Which is, we're in contact with Russian politicians. We're in contact with Russian businessmen who have assured us that should Putin fall and you step in, they'll back you. And we understand that you're in contact.
So this is fascinating speculation. It is just speculation, and he's saying it's speculation, but it could be. Now, what's interesting here is that no generals came over to Prigozhin's side. No oligarchs came over to Prigozhin's side. Survikin came out against, who's notably an ally of Prigozhin, came out and made that official statement against him. So it didn't work out like Prigozhin said, but that's an interesting thought of what could have been. But again, he even admitted that's just speculation. So let's hear what else he has to say.
Contact with all the generals, and you claim that all the generals are on your side secretly. So we think between the two of us, we have this nice little package here. I think Prigozhin thought that when he crossed the line of departure and moved towards Rostov, that he would have Surovikin and Alexeyev, these 2 generals who gave public statements saying, don't do this. But I think he believed that they would do it. First of all, why did they give statements? Because everybody knows that Prigozhin had been in contact with them in the lead up to this. Prigozhin was calling everybody, begging for intervention. And these guys, of course, being loyal servants of Russia, contacted the intelligence service and said, hey, Prigozhin, talk to us again. They went, all right, well, just keep talking to him. Keep the line of communication open. Let's find out what he's doing. But when Prigozhin crossed in, they both came out and said, hey, boss, don't do it. Bad move. This is not a good look. And they also appealed to the Wagner soldiers, telling them not to do it. But he also believed that there would be others out there. He believed that there was an entire cadre of combat-hardened Russian leaders or military leaders who were as frustrated as he was with what they call the parquet generals, the generals that live in the shiny offices and never leave for the front lines. There is legitimate. I mean, Prigozhin has a point here. There is a legitimate gripe in the Russian military about a Russian leadership that is removed from the reality of war, oftentimes involved in things other than helping them in war, some corruption, some incompetence. There's legitimate complaints there. But he was hoping that these people, these combat leaders, would rally around him. Didn't happen. And no politicians rallied around him. No businessmen rallied around him. He was isolated. But I think he honestly believed that everything was going to fall in place, that if he just started moving towards Moscow, all of this descent towards Putin that he had manufactured on his own, but he had also hyped up, people fed back saying, we're with you. He thought everybody would come. But it turns out, and this is, again, where McFall and Applebaum are just dead wrong, Putin is an extraordinarily popular leader.
So he says that, but there's a difference between popularity, like I would vote for you, all other things being equal, if I didn't have a gun to my head, and I'm not going to oppose you because I don't want bad things to happen to me. That second one is a kind of popularity that Putin enjoys, not the, if I had a choice between you and Navalny or someone else, I would, in a legitimate, unrigged election, I would vote for you, Putin. I'm not sure that it's like that, and it's less like that now that the cracks have been exposed.
Are you saying British intelligence wanted Prigozhin to step into power or just destabilize Putin?
I think they're number one. First of all, I think that everybody understands that Prigozhin could never be in power. Prigozhin would never be the leader and all that.
He's nuts.
What they wanted was the collapse of Vladimir Putin's government. And then they have handpicked people in London that are prepared to come in and take over. People who, again, the oligarch class, people need to understand when you have corruption, you have criminals, and criminals aren't loyal to the country. They're loyal to money. And Russia is still populated by a tremendous number of criminal oligarchs who resent Putin, resent what he's doing, and would be more than happy to throw their weight behind a new president who promised the lifting of sanctions, who promised them wealth. It's
also interesting to hear Scott Ritter mention that and say that and confirm that. I mean, we know this in the West, but for him to confirm that is really interesting. It's kind of like if a Republican does something, all the Democrats come out and they say, that Republican's bad, that Republican's bad, that Republican's bad. But when a Republican or other Republicans say, you know what, that's not cool, that shouldn't be happening, it has a different level of credibility because, like, we expect the Democrats to say that Republican's bad. So when Scott Ritter is confirming this about the oligarchs and that's how that works, it's something to pay attention to.
Wealth for the nation, but personal wealth. And so they would have disposed of Prigozhin that quick because he's a thug. I mean, they throw that word around about Putin all the time. Putin's a thug. Putin ain't a thug. Prigozhin's a thug. Straight up thug.
Putin is kind of a thug. I mean, he's operated in this kind of way. Prigozhin is a significant thug. Putin's just a thug in a collared shirt.
With the rap sheet to prove it. So
I asked you this when we interviewed you last, but things have changed. You're Joe Biden. What do you do to bring this to a conclusion? And to hear the rest of the interview, please go to usefulidiots.substack.com.
Yeah, we're not going to watch the rest of the interview. So that was pretty amazing. And there's a lot to be gained by listening to the other side. You can hear what they have to say, and then you can triangulate on what you already know, what you hear in free press, and you have to triangulate there as well. But once you do that, if you don't just listen to one source, listen to multiple sources and get a sense of what's going on. And even Scott Ritter can be right occasionally. So thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, sharing this, for the subscribes, for the coffees, for just being the kind of person that's willing and interested in listening and expanding your mind, building the dendrites in your head to understand what's going on. Thank you most of all for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.